Hello and welcome to Crosstalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. The continuing and consistent rise of China, be it declaring restrictive fly zones or a critical view on the subject of buying U.S. dollar debt, Beijing is sending signals it will be respected and will act as any great power in today's world. In fact, it would appear China is tearing a page from Washington's playbook. It too will make rules to fit its geopolitical interests. To crosstalk China's geopolitical interest, I'm joined by my guest, John Feffer in Washington. He is an author and co-director of foreign policy in focus at the Institute for Policy Studies. And in London, we cross to Martin McCauley. He is a specialist on international affairs at the University of London. Thank you, gentlemen, for joining me. Crosstalk rules in effect. That means you can jump in anytime you want, and I very much encourage it. Martin, if I can go to you first. We've been seeing the American pivot to Asia. At least it's been announced. It's lost a lot of energy, and over the last few weeks, it's a little bit more focused with Biden visiting the region. And we have the Chinese with their new restrictive air zones and travel routes. What step is this in the new battle for the Pacific in your mind?
I think that the Chinese are, in fact, they have recognized that President Obama is a weak president, and therefore they're pushing as far as they can go. They've actually talked about their perimeter, the Pacific perimeter, reaching to Hawaii. That's in the long future, but of course not in the short term. And what they're doing is actually implementing that gradually. You remember that they still have a confrontation with the Philippines over the Scarborough Shoal, where they claim some islands, some rocks, and the Filipinos say they don't, and so on. That's going on. And now they've just decided unilaterally to put in a defensive zone. Apparently there is oil and gas, especially a gas field, within it. So therefore one could say it's linked not only to great power ambitions, geopolitical ambitions, but also to hydrocarbons, because China desperately needs to increase its oil and gas output.
Okay, John, is China demanding Washington respect it as an equal in the Pacific? It can't do that militarily at this point. But, you know, for the Chinese, they have a long view, I think we would all agree.
Mm-hmm. Well, I would slightly disagree with Martin here. It's true that China perhaps perceives Obama as weak, but I see this more in the longer term, and that is that the United States is largely playing a bystander role in this. The Pacific pivot is in some ways an acknowledgement of the U.S. bystander role over the last decade. And this is largely between China and Japan, this current issue. The United States has encouraged Japan to have a more aggressive, a more muscular, shall we say, foreign and military policy. And China, of course, as you say, wants to have a foreign policy that is concomitant with its economic strength, its growing economic strength. So we see these two tigers on the mountain, as the expression goes in the Asia realm. And the United States really is caught in the middle. It doesn't really want to tangle with China, and at the same time it has to support its ally Japan. But it's mostly a bystander role that it's playing.
John, if I can stay with you, it's very interesting how you phrase this, because the weakest link of American foreign policy in the Pacific is its allies, potentially, because what the Japanese want to be more aggressive, the Filipinos, the South Koreans, and go on and on. It's a precarious position for the United States to be put in, because it wants to be quote-unquote neutral, but not everyone in the region wants the United States to be neutral. And then, because of these treaty commitments, the United States may find itself having to do something that it really doesn't want to do. Go ahead, John.
Mm-hmm. Well, as you point out, the United States, professes to be neutral. It has kind of secured its position in the Asia-Pacific region as a so-called honest broker. And so it has tried to do this. At the same time, of course, it has allies. So it's very difficult for the United States to actually be an honest broker when it supplies South Korea with a tremendous amount of military support. As I said, has supported Japan for some time, provides Taiwan with a great deal of military support. So So the honest broker position is actually rather difficult. And yet at the same time, we have seen China and Japan, as well as China and some of the countries bordering the South China Sea, come to some agreements, for instance, over oil and gas exploration undersea. And these agreements, I think, could be the kind of core of some agreement in the future. One of those agreements was just back in 2008 around the Diaoyu Senkaku Islands, and we've seen some additional movement toward agreement in South China Sea.
Okay, Martin, but if I could put China's policy in a nutshell, it doesn't want to have to ask for someone's permission anymore. This is the whole point of these new restrictive air zones, is that China is going to say, you know, well, if you want to go through here, you're going to have to talk to us here. We'll let you through, but you have to talk to us. It's an acknowledgement that they are a great power in the Pacific, because all of these zones since the 1950s were unilaterally done by other powers, particularly the United States and Japan. They didn't ask China's permission.
Yes, that's absolutely correct. But China has to be very careful here, because if it becomes quite aggressive in pushing its geopolitical interests, it will alienate or frighten the other nations in Southeast Asia. That's one of the reasons for the rapprochement between Vietnam and the United States. China keeps on saying it wants to resolve all these problems amicably and peacefully and so on. It's not an enemy, it's not aggressive, it has no aggressive intentions and so on. But if it in fact is quite aggressive in pursuing its interests at present, and the rhetoric against Japan is quite torrid, it gives the impression that it's a power on the rise. One of the interesting things about China is they've studied Imperial Germany before 1914 to try and work out why the strongest country in Europe ended up being defeated in 1918, an absolute disaster, and so ended up in a disastrous war. So therefore China is very careful in going forward. But the thin end of the wedge is that if Japan and South Korea and the Philippines and the Americans give in to this and they file all their flight plans with the Chinese, one day may come where the Chinese will say you can't have military aircraft flying through this zone. And then after that, you can't have naval, you can only have commercial shipping, you can't have any naval ships and so on. So everyone knows that this is the beginning of a very long process.
John, how do you react to that? Because we just heard from Martin, you have to be careful, but then, you know, if you want to get what you want, you have to take risks. How do you balance being careful and taking risks? Because that's taking risks is when you achieve your goals, not by just being careful.
Right. Right, and it's not really a zero option in which China makes an assertion and then, you know, the United States and its allies either accept it or don't accept it. I mean, we can see this as the first kind of play in a larger gambit. China has said, look, you know, the structure here in Northeast Asia is in some sense a relic of World War II. And there are many relics of World War II, the United Nations, in some sense voting power in the IMF World Bank. And China is saying, look, you know, the situation in this world has changed. And even though some countries in the region, Japan, South Korea, are still kind of fighting over issues related to World War II, China is saying, look, we have to move on, and this is one way of doing it, by saying, hey, we are going to, in some sense, by ourselves, redraw the maps here in Northeast Asia to reflect modern realities. Now, again, the United States and its allies should not see this as, you know, yes or no, but okay, look, this is what you have said. We're going to come back with our offer on the table, and then we can negotiate around that, and then we'll see perhaps a line drawn for airspace that is a better reflection of the realities on the ground in the region today.
Martin, do you think the United States is really interested in dealing with China as an equal? Because I think what John just said makes perfect sense. We are living in the 21st century. Second World War was a long time ago, though I would add, John, the caveat, the Chinese do remember the Second World War and what the Japanese did to them. Martin, I mean, history does play a role here, but new realities do as well.
Yes, they do, because the Chinese would like the Japanese to apologize for what happened between 1931 and 1945, and especially in places like Nanjing and so on, and the Japanese absolutely refused to do that. And from China's point of view, when things get perhaps strained domestically, they can play the nationalist card. And it's very, very easy for Xi Jinping or or any other Chinese politician to whip up antagonism towards Japan because it's a great enemy and so on. But Japan has a tremendous amount of investment in China, and China needs Japanese technology and so on. They need Japanese business and so on. So therefore, they've got to balance the two. And very often, talking to Chinese, when you say to them, you have to balance your relations with Japan, they say, no, 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 they have to apologize and what they did to us and so on. And the Koreans also have some remnants of this because obviously Japan occupied Korea between 1905 and 1945, and there are memories of that and so on. So Japan is seen really as the enemy. So it's a real conflict between the two. But from the American point of view, they would like them to come together, bury the hatchet, as John said, right, let's draw some lines. If you look at the actual lines that they've drawn, they of course cover all the oil and gas, which they think is underneath the soil, underneath the seabed. And the obvious solution is to say to Japan, to South Korea, to Vietnam, Brunei and Philippines and so on, okay, let's develop these resources on an equal basis. We can share the wealth which is under the seabed, but China at present doesn't see it like that. They don't see why they should share with other powers. They're the rising power, and therefore their will should in fact be listened to, and they will decide what will happen and so on. And the temptation for China now is, given the state of the United States economy, is to press very hard indeed for more concessions, with the United States saying, let's pacify this, let's talk, let's have a hotline between Tokyo and Beijing and one between Seoul and Beijing and so on. Let's talk about this because we're all in it together.
All right, gentlemen, we're going to have to jump in here. We're going to go to a short break in the United States. Okay, John, I'd like to go back to you in Washington. What we heard from Martin right before the break makes perfect sense to me, because the Chinese looking at the Pacific and looking at the United States and saying, why should we compromise so much? I mean, the Americans don't compromise a whole lot, particularly in the Middle East and what it's done to the Western Hemisphere for 2 centuries. I mean, why should we compromise? It may be the right thing to do, the rational thing to do, but there's nationalism, there's a great sense of pride, and I think a lot of people forget in the world that China's coming back. It's not rising. We just took a break for a couple of centuries, victim of Western imperialism. Word is coming back, okay? I think that's the kind of mindset the Chinese have. And, you know, it's kind of hard to deny, even though it may be dangerous.
Well, I think that's true, but another kind of priority for China, of course, is economic growth and the political stability that results in some sense from rapid, if best, double-digit economic growth. And anything that challenges that economic growth, domestic economic growth, I think is antithetical to China. So if it sees that regional tensions, for instance, make Northeast Asia less of an investment opportunity, if they see somehow that this affects the bottom line in China, then I think they'll basically dial it back a bit. I mean, if they see that, for instance, as Martin said, the United States and Vietnam have become very close. If they see that Japan, for instance, goes beyond its 1%, its historic kind of tradition of 1% of GDP for military spending, then, you know, they're going to possibly say, okay, look, you know, this was our preference, but we'll negotiate. So I think there's still plenty of room to negotiate with China, even if it is pushing for as much as it can get against the United States, which it sees as weak economically and perhaps with weak leadership, even if it sees opportunity in Northeast Asia for a variety of geopolitical and political reasons.
Martin, the Chinese have this fear of not getting access to the outside world, and when looking at trade routes, I mean, what will it take for a compromise? Because it seems to me that the Chinese want to be the hegemon. They don't want to be the only power. They want to be the hegemon. They want people to kowtow, say, we just want to go through this passage of water. We want to fly over this piece of land. And the Chinese will probably be okay with that, even though that is a slippery slope. What about military hardware in the future? But they want to be the hegemon. They don't want to be the sole power, because if you're the sole power, then you're responsible for everything. And again, I think thinking, the Chinese that have looked at American history. You don't want to be the hegemon of the world because there's a lot of downside being the world hegemon.
Yes, because at present China's main priority is economic. They want to make sure that the 200 million or so who are in poverty in China, that they leave poverty and they become more prosperous. And the Communist Party knows that the rising middle class means stability. If 500 million Chinese are middle class, then almost certainly the country would be very stable. Then domestically, it's stable. That's the first priority. Therefore, the Beijing cannot do anything which would, in fact, harm that economic growth. They don't want to get into a conflict with Japan, and to have a military conflict, face-to-face conflict. They don't want a military conflict with the United States. They don't want to be seen as the bad boys. They want to be seen as, okay, we'll talk to you and so on. We're very polite and so on. We don't want to lose face and so on. The other thing is that China, in fact, is a country which feels that over the last 100 years, or at least 100 years before 1949, it was treated very badly by the outside world. And that still rankles. That's still in Chinese history textbooks. And Chinese repeat this to you. They talk about the Opium Wars and things like that. That still rankles with them and so on. So therefore, they're working that out. And they still haven't actually entered the world stage as a great power. They concern themselves really with economic interests, and they're not really a major player in the world. The United States would like them to become a major player. Okay, let's become one of the hegemons of the world, and so on. But that entails responsibilities. That means promoting stability and peace and solving problems and so on. And China, at this stage in its economic development, doesn't want that role. It wants to concentrate basically on improving its economy and ensuring that its middle class becomes very large, and that means stability for China.
John, people have looked at the American pivot to... You want to jump in? Go ahead, John. Go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say that, you know, if you look at one of the most recent indicators, which is that the yuan has become the second most frequently traded currency and in trade transactions, and this just happened recently, and that sounds very impressive, of course. I mean, the dollar is still number one, but the yuan is number two, and the growth was actually quite remarkable. Just maybe a year ago, it was maybe between 1% and 2%, and now it's about 8%. Now, that's the telling statistic. It's only still about 8%. So there's a gap between, you know, China's status as number two and where it would like to be, which is parity. In the United States, still around, you know, in the 80s, 90% of transactions, yuan around 8%. So there's still a major gap that China wants to bridge, and it knows it's going to take some time in order to do that. So it's this calculus of figuring out how to make assertions of authority, how to get the respect that it wants, how to be able to wield the power it wants to have, and yet recognizing that it's not quite there yet in terms of the indicators.
John, if I can stay with you, one indicator is, and it's very good for populations, people watching TV in China, is battleships and destroyers and airplanes. And, you know, we have the American pivot to the Pacific. Some people look at it as kind of a strategic retreat. But for China, and again, it's all going back to what Martin had to say about middle class values, they like a strong country. They want their country to be respected. And that's translated very often in military hardware. You know, you want to be able to see on TV that, you know, we're protecting our borders and we're not going to be held back. We're not, you know, maybe they don't, I don't know if they say it on Chinese television, but, you know, Pacific, all the way to Hawaii, okay? That really does speak to a middle class and a middle class nationalism, but you got to have the fleet. So my question is that some people will say, critics will say, the pivot actually militarizes the Pacific even more.
Well, you know, the pivot is, again, as I said, in some sense, a recognition of the U.S. weakness in the region. For instance, its inability to build another Marine Air Force base in Okinawa. I mean, there's been such political opposition in Okinawa, and it's essentially forced the United States to redistribute those Marines elsewhere, to Guam, to Australia, to negotiate new treaties with the Philippines. So I don't see it as a remilitarization in that sense. I don't see that there will actually be a major increase in the amount of U.S. hardware, although the capabilities of the U.S. military in the region may increase. But it is a remilitarization in the sense that there's an arms race in the region. There has been an arms race for many years. That means that Japan, South Korea, modernizing, spending a lot more money. China, double-digit increases in their military budget. But further south as well, Singapore, Vietnam, Indonesia, Philippines, all embarked on major arms purchases. And this, I think, is a major concern. The United States, of course, would like there to be more burden sharing. That's part of its so-called strategic rebalancing. So that is, I'm afraid, the negative consequence of this this shoulder burden sharing, and that is all the countries in the region basically butting up against one another through their increased military purchases and their more aggressive military policies.
Well, you know, arms companies in the United States, Martin, really probably like this arms race here. But what about the American taxpayer? I mean, you know, you look what's happened in the Middle East over the last decade or so. Americans are really tired of that. And if you look at what happened just in the last few days, Detroit's in bankruptcy. I mean, again, you know, I mean, is it really worth it for the United States? Because as John pointed out, there's all these other countries that are just, you know, getting maybe not a free ride, but not a very expensive ride. And it's the Americans that are doing all the heavy carrying here. I mean, at what point is there a tipping point? Do you think the United States is going to say, "Hey, let's just make a détente with the Chinese and split up the Pacific because it's not worth it to us"?
Yes, it's worth pointing out that the Vietnam, Singapore, South Korea, and Indonesia and so on are not enemies. They have a common interest. There's no conflict there. They're arming because they fear the rise of China. And they want the United States, really the nuclear umbrella. They would love for the US to come in and say, as NATO does in Europe, why not come and extend that nuclear umbrella to us? But of course, from the American point of view, why should they do that? Why should they spend, the taxpayer has to pay out more dollars to protect Southeast Asia? Why should they do that? And that will be an increasing problem for any US president because the United States is now militarily withdrawing from the Middle East, having been seen to be defeated in 2 wars. You don't intervene on the ground anymore. I think that's a lesson from the Middle East. What you're going to see is more cyber warfare, because the Chinese are really hot on cyber warfare, and there'll be more link-ups between Singapore, Vietnam, and all the other Southeast Asian states and the United States, because the Americans are way out in front in technology and so on. And therefore, what they're looking for is high technology transfer. They're not really expecting the Americans to put troops in Singapore, Vietnam, and so on. That wouldn't really do very much. But they want high technology, and they want the Southeast Asia not to fall behind, because if America walks away, then that hands over the high technology initiative to China, and those countries will never catch up. And they know that by themselves, they are no match for China, so therefore they desperately need American cooperation and a commitment from the Americans that that Washington will just not desert them and walk away.
Okay, John, I'm just getting real quickly, 20 seconds. I guess we all should hope that both sides know how to play chicken well.
Absolutely. And as I said, there are opportunities for negotiation based on negotiations in the past. And this is an opportunity for all the countries to step up to the plate and show their diplomatic agility. Japan, China, Korea, they all in some sense have elected nationalist leaders.
All right, gentlemen, I have to jump in here. Fascinating discussion, but we've run out of time. Many thanks today to my guests in Washington and in London. And thanks to our viewers for watching us here at RTC.